I gave Spider-Man 2 a 9.5 out of 10, so needless to say, I'm a big fan of the game. I know a lot of you enjoyed it as well, and today I wanted to take a look at the game's predecessor. I want to look at Spider-Man 1. This will be my first time playing Insomniac's first Spider-Man installment since completing Spider-Man 2. I think this will be a great opportunity to go back and see how that first game holds up, and just to see some of the improvements that Insomniac made between installments. So without any further ado, let's boot this up. As far as I'm concerned, this opening cutscene is a masterclass in visual storytelling and is one of the greatest character introductions I have ever seen. This is the first time we're meeting this iteration of Peter Parker. He's 8 years into his career as Spider-Man, which sounds like a lot of lore to catch up on, and yet within the span of a single 1 minute long tracking shot through his apartment, Insomniac effectively catches us up to speed. We get to see from photographs which friends he's had. We get to see Uncle Ben and Aunt May. From newspaper clippings on the wall, we get to see which villains he's faced as Spider-Man. We get to see where he is financially. We get to see what kind of suit upgrades and gadget upgrades he's working on for his suit. And so by the time we see the character model and hear Yuri Lowenthal's voice performance, I already feel like I know this version of the character. I don't feel like I'm meeting him for the first time. And because they establish so well how important characters like MJ and Aunt May are, again, just in this single tracking shot through his apartment, when we run into them in the game, it feels like running into old friends, not like we're running into them for the first time. It's an insane amount of world building for a very brief opening cutscene.
All units, level 4 mobilization. Location, Fisk Tower.
Fisk?
I also love this visual cue that really just very well sets up the duality between Peter Parker and Spider-Man and some of the issues that causes. As far as visuals go, this game actually holds up very well, which doesn't surprise me. The game looked great in 2018 on PS4, and it looked even better when the remaster brought ray tracing and higher resolutions and frame rates to PS5. I do understand that some people were disappointed when Spider-Man 2 didn't bring with it an even higher leap in graphical fidelity, but honestly, video game graphics in the last 5 to 7 years have started looking so good, and the technology behind them has been so solid that they're just aging better than we've ever seen video games age before. And as a result, I think a lot of the inherent improvements that we're seeing in graphics these days might be a little bit less noticeable than they once were. With that being said, I'm not saying that I don't think Spider-Man 2 is the superior looking game. I think that the graphics were improved greatly with crisper textures, smoother animations, better looking skyboxes, and a more vibrant and detailed city. Even as I swing around New York City here, while it still looks good, it is definitely missing a lot of that personality and vibrance that we got in Spider-Man 2. But even without some of those enhancements, this isn't a huge step back visually. Insomniac did great work in 2018 and 2020 on this game, and it still holds up very well, like I said. One thing so far that isn't holding up for me super great, though, is the web swinging. This feels very slow and very clunky in comparison to the web swinging in Spider-Man 2, and that's not really a criticism targeted at this game as much as praise aimed at Spider-Man 2. Up until playing the sequel, I never felt like this game had slow or watered down swinging mechanics, but now it definitely feels a little bit obsolete. And it just goes to show how improved this system was in the sequel and how much work Insomniac put into it.
For their hot, fresh cup of bodily harm.
While I was expecting swinging to feel a little bit slower, I was definitely a little surprised at how much slower and clunky it felt, and I have to say the same about combat here. This definitely feels a lot slower as well. It doesn't have a lot of the bells and whistles of the sequel, which is to be expected, but I'm even noticing things like Spider-Man is targeting the wrong enemies sometimes. Sometimes he's not punching the enemy that I'm trying to get him to punch. Sometimes he's shooting webs at an enemy that I'm not intending for him to shoot webs at. And I don't want to speak on this too much just because I don't really know what has changed and what hasn't. It could be as simple as just better sound design in the sequel, but it definitely feels slower, and there also definitely seems to be less responsiveness. It just doesn't feel quite as intuitive. Don't get me wrong, the combat holds up pretty well here, but it was definitely improved in the sequel, and I don't think I recognized just how much it was improved until I saw how much it regresses when you go back to the first game. And I'd really like to emphasize that, again, I'm not retroactively criticizing this game, I'm just very impressed that Insomniac was able to take gameplay systems that people liked and thought worked well, and overhaul them and rework them and improve them to a point where now going back to these same systems in this same game feels outdated and clunky by comparison.
We'll look for the bombs.
Another thing that I really want to praise Insomniac for is their incredible set pieces. The way that the missions are designed and the way that they're built into the environments feel really cool and very true to the world and the character. The things that they have you doing as Spider-Man in these environments, like saving civilians from falling rubble, it just feels so empowering. It really puts you in the shoes of the character, and it keeps the storytelling of the missions engaging. So that's something that Insomniac has done right from day one. I will say that I've noticed playing through this game again so far that some of this does feel paced a little bit slower. And there's some pros and cons to that. There's some cons in the sense that, you're ready to finish the objective, and sometimes it feels like the mission is dragging on a little bit longer than you'd like. But in Spider-Man 2, everything felt so rushed that occasionally I wanted moments to have more time to breathe. I don't know, I feel like if they found a happy medium between the two for Spider-Man 3, that game would be in really great shape. Both games are great in their own respective ways, and the set pieces and mission design really contribute to the empowering feeling of playing as Spider-Man. One area that I think many of us will agree was kind of underwhelming in this game is the boss fights. It feels like Insomniac was still finding their footing here. I wouldn't say that the boss fights are overly bad or glaringly awful, but they definitely do not have the same level of quality that we see in their subsequent releases. In Spider-Man Miles Morales, that opening boss fight, you're steering Rhino through a busy shopping mall. In Spider-Man 2, when you're going up against Lizard, it's this crazy multi-stage fight where you're chasing him through the city and having this insanely difficult battle with him in the sewers. And there's just nothing like that in this first game. You're basically thrown into a usually fairly uninteresting arena, and there's one or two bosses that you're having to take down. And I did like that idea that sometimes you'd have to take down two bosses at the same time, so you'd get to fight Electro and Vulture at the same time, or Rhino and Scorpion. But in execution, I just really didn't feel like they went very far. There's just nothing really to set these encounters apart from regular combat encounters with normal thugs throughout the rest of the game. There's no enemy health bars. There's nothing particularly difficult about them. There's not really a learning curve. They just feel underwhelming, like I mentioned. Again, they're not bad, but they are one of the weaker aspects of the game, and they're just not very memorable. Okay, quick side note. I always thought it would be really funny if this happened.
1 month! In 1 month you'll wish you had me back!
I'm sorry I'm late.
After the opening mission, the game introduces you to Dr. Octavius for the first time, who in this story is actually Peter's boss. I think that's a really cool idea, and it's a great story that Insomniac does a great job with. If I was really going to get nitpicky about it, I would say that I feel like the first two acts of this game are kind of slow in terms of Spider-Man's development. We see a lot with Peter Parker, his relationship with MJ, his relationship with Aunt May, his relationship with Otto. Granted, a lot of these are pushed through phone calls and audio recordings, and so it's not tons of face-to-face interactions all the time. Though you do get those as well, a lot of the development happens through phone calls, but by the third act, it's this crazy, really rushed experience where Doc Ock goes crazy, breaks the Sinister Six out of the raft, and there's a lot of boss fights and a lot of really interesting things happening in the story. And I do wish that this had happened earlier in the story. It feels like they hold off on this part for too long. And as a result, in the first two acts, Spider-Man is investigating Martin Lee. But for a video game, for this medium, it does feel like a slower story. And I wish that there was a little bit more to do. Even if they didn't have Dr. Octavius transform into Doc Ock earlier, I think even having a secondary villain, like maybe giving Shocker a bigger role, or having Electro be involved in what Mr. Negative is doing, or maybe having Vulture doing his own thing on the side that Spider-Man is also trying to take care of, may have added some more of those interesting set pieces and moments that felt a little bit too few and far between in the opening hours of the game, in my opinion. At this point, the game kind of pauses the main story in order to encourage the player to explore the open world and get a sense of the side content. And Manhattan in of itself is a great open world map. There's so much to see, and the music that plays while you're swinging around is super fun and energetic. Not to mention, you generally have J. Jonah Jameson in your ear ranting about Spider-Man on a podcast. So it feels really lived in, it feels really fun. There's some interesting lore tidbits you can find by taking photos of landmarks and picking up Peter's old backpacks. There's some research stations that allow you to utilize your traversal mechanics in ways that the rest of the game doesn't, so that added some interesting variety. And some of the side missions had some really interesting narrative implications. I really liked what they did with Taskmaster and Tombstone. With that being said, one thing that I really had to get used to is that the side content of Insomniac's Spider-Man games really is geared toward making him feel like a friendly neighborhood Spider-Man game. Remember, this came out in 2018 fresh off the heels of the Arkham series, where side missions were more built around combat and villains that weren't in the main story. Like in Arkham City, you could go fight Deadshot and Hush and Victor Zsasz, and they didn't appear in the main story, but they were still a threat in the city that you got to go take out as Batman. And I think I went into Spider-Man thinking it would be similar. I kept thinking maybe we'll get a Sandman or Lizard side mission that will take us down a rabbit hole that is just a little bit of an offshoot of the main story. And there was a little bit of that, like I mentioned with Tombstone, and there was like a Mr. Negative side mission where he'd corrupted people at a Halloween party and you were trying to find them and rescue them. But generally speaking, the side missions were geared toward helping the little guy. And for a while, I just wasn't very interested in some of this content. I didn't want to go find all of Howard's pigeons. I wasn't really interested in helping a birdwatcher in Central Park. And I actually think that the inclusion of the Friendly Neighborhood app in future games really has helped this, because it's made it just feel more cohesive. Whereas here it didn't really feel like there was a reason for me to be doing some of those missions. But after playing some of the other games and looking back at it retroactively, this is something that works a little bit better for me. I still think that some of the checklist-based side missions feel underwhelming. I really wish, for example, that we could have maybe chased Black Cat through the city or had some kind of in-person encounter with her instead of just taking photos of places she's robbed. But largely speaking, I think the side content here is fine. Some of it really shines, some of it is really not great. I really hate that I have to take down like 30 to 50 network towers before I can even see the map. That was just such a poor gameplay choice, in my opinion, for a Spider-Man game. But generally speaking, most of it is fine. It works, and it gives you something to do when you're not focusing on the main story. Now, once the game kind of invites you back into the main story, it's interesting because, like I mentioned earlier, it is a slower pace. The first 2 acts of this game are pretty slow and methodical. It's about Spider-Man trying to investigate Mr. Negative, and Peter Parker is reconnecting with MJ. It's a really deeply personal story that's well told, but the gameplay loop does sometimes turn into, hey, go visit Dr. Octavius's lab and watch a cutscene. Cool, now go visit MJ and watch a cutscene. Awesome, now go to the feast and watch a cutscene. Oh wait, now Doc Ock needs something else. Go back and watch a cutscene. So sometimes it almost feels like you're swinging back and forth to watch the next scene of a movie rather than playing a game. There are moments where I think that there could have been a little bit more action or a little bit more Spider-Man content to kind of break up the gameplay loop, because while narratively it retains its intrigue, there's a lot of moments where the gameplay loop just feels too slow, and it doesn't feel like you're doing enough. However, I will say that one thing that this game does better than Spider-Man 2 and Miles Morales is give its plot points more time to breathe. When something big happens, you have time to digest it. In Spider-Man 2, everything was rushing through the plot points so quickly that it was like, dang, Spider-Man is getting rid of the symbiote suit as quickly as he got it. Like, geez, there's just no time for any of this to develop. Like, wow, Harry has gone through like 5 major character changes in like the last 2 hours. And so in this game, I do appreciate that there is more time for it to breathe. And some of the missions, similarly, I think I mentioned this earlier as well, have a little bit more time to feel lived in. There are moments in Spider-Man 2 where things are just over so quickly because the game is rushing, and that's fun in its own way. It's fun to feel like you're rushing through just incredible encounter after incredible encounter, but it almost feels like there needs to be a balance, because while this game sometimes feels too slow, I'd argue that Spider-Man 2 often feels like it's moving too quickly. And looking back at it, I do miss some of these slower paced stealth missions that have you just looking at the environments as you're slowly working your way through. I do miss some of those plot points that happen kind of few and far between, just so that you have some time to really think about them. Spider-Man 2, in my opinion, is a much better game in almost every respect, just because Insomniac had time to build upon everything they did well in this game. But I think that they did lose some of that more ponderous side of the story, where you can really sit and think about the implications of what's happening, whereas Spider-Man 2 felt like all killer, no filler, to the extent that things just started to feel kind of forgettable because the story didn't really treat them with reverence in its pacing. Now, the last thing that I did is I actually booted up a later save of the game once I have more gadgets, just to see what the gameplay and swinging felt like, and while it still doesn't feel as satisfying as Spider-Man 2, it is a faster traversal experience, it is a more interesting combat experience, and one thing I definitely miss from this game are the suit abilities and the gadgets. That's something that Brian Intihar, the creative director, has said they removed because they didn't want to give players just automatic win buttons. But there are so many enemies that come out in these waves where you're playing through bases or through these big combat encounters that I never felt overpowered using these, like, crazy abilities that could take down, like, 6 guys with one button press. They just felt like ways that I could get started in a combat encounter, but usually I was still fighting my way through it. I really liked the Web Blossom ability, I really liked a lot of these gadgets, and it kind of added an extra dimension to the gameplay, and I never felt like they gave me too much of one gadget. It always felt like I had to use them sparingly and be kind of clever about how I utilized them. So I do think that a lot of the web abilities and a lot of the gadgets were done better in this game. But once again, the basic combat, the basic traversal, I would say still never feels quite as good as Spider-Man 2. Well, I feel like I've rambled on about it long enough, so my consensus is Spider-Man 2 made huge improvements to this first game. Insomniac really took what worked in this game and what didn't work in this game and found ways to improve it. The MJ missions are much better in Spider-Man 2. The combat, the traversal, the story pacing, I think, is a marked improvement in the sequel, but I would also say that the sequel lost some of the heart that this first game had. I'm actually really curious to hear what you guys think in the comments below. Which game do you prefer? Which one do you think has the better story? Because I think the stories are both really well done conceptually, and they were just executed in different ways. I feel like this game is slower in its pacing, and Spider-Man 2 is very fast in its pacing. And there's benefits to each. I got bored less frequently in Spider-Man 2, but I also found Spider-Man 2 to be less memorable. It's kind of an interesting case study in balance and finding that balance to pacing. I actually think both games have suffered from overstuffing their third acts with things that could have been explored more in Act 2 before you get to the big finale. But overall, I think both are great games, and it's so cool to see Insomniac working in an upward trajectory, especially in the gameplay department, and if they continue on this trajectory, I think Spider-Man 3 is going to be an all-timer great game. But anyway, thanks you guys so much for watching. Please be sure to like and subscribe if you enjoyed the video. Once again, let me know in the comments below which Insomniac Spider-Man game is your favorite, and we will see you guys in the next one.